All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm currently in the JavaScript portion, and it's time to get into JavaScript objects. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to say it again, and that is that JavaScript is not an object-oriented programming language, in my opinion. In my opinion, for a language to be truly object-oriented, you have to use objects all the time in basically everything that you do. And that's not the case in JavaScript. I look at JavaScript instead as being an object-based programming language, which means it has full object-oriented features, but you are by no means required to use them. So, as it says here in the introduction, in JavaScript, most things are objects, from core JavaScript features like arrays to the browser APIs or application program interfaces built on top of JavaScript. You can even create your own objects to encapsulate related functions and variables into efficient packages and act as handy data containers. The object-based nature of JavaScript is important to understand that if you want to go further with your knowledge of the language, that basically you'll have to understand this. All right, so this is just the intro. So as far as what's in here, as you can see, we're going to start with object basics. As it says, we'll look at fundamental JavaScript object syntax, revisit some JavaScript features we've looked at previously, and kind of get ready to start using objects. Then we got object-oriented JavaScript for beginners. It says with the basics out of the way, we'll focus on object-oriented JavaScript. The article, as it says, presents a basic view of object-oriented programming theory, then explores how JavaScript emulates classes using constructor functions and how to create object instances. From there, we'll look at object prototypes. And prototypes are one way, kind of at least in my opinion, the old-fashioned way that we used to do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. All right. So as it says in there, they will talk about how prototype chains work and then look at the prototype property. All right. Next is inheritance in JavaScript, which, as it says, the article shows how to create child classes that inherit from their parent classes. From there, we'll go into working with JSON data. Remember, JSON is an acronym that stands for JavaScript Object Notation. As they say there, it's a standard text-based format for representing structured data based on JavaScript object syntax. It's used virtually by just about every programming language there is. All right. And finally, there's a practice, which again, I'm not going to, it says, let's see, in this article we dive into a practical exercise. We may or may not go into that. I will not be going through the bouncing balls demo though. So, okay. All right. So let's get started. And again, we have now gone through the getting started with the web. So we went through all those lessons. We went through the entire HTML, so the introduction to HTML. We went through the multimedia and embedding. We went through the HTML tables. We also went through the entire CSS, so the CSS first steps, the CSS building blocks, the styling text, and the CSS layout. We are now in the JavaScript, and we've done already the first steps. We've done the building blocks, which brings us up to where we are right now under JavaScript objects. From there, we'll have two more asynchronous JavaScript and client-side web APIs. So With all that said, let's get into object basics.